Hi my loves, welcome back. Today we're going to be doing a very long overdue book video. I really wanted to be more on time with my book videos this year, but it just didn't work out because I went away for kind of from middle of February to middle of March, so it kind of messed me up. So we're going to do a February to April books today. I'm filming this on the penultimate day of April, I think. Oh no, the last day of April. And yeah, I read fewer books than I thought I was going to read whilst I was away as well, because I was just busy doing other things, as is sometimes the case. So we do have a very large pile, but it's fewer than it should be for 3 months worth of reading. Oh, I'm just rearranging you guys a little bit so I can sit back against the wall, because I feel like this is going to be a long one. Anyway, thank you guys for your patience. Let's get into it before I ramble on for another 15 minutes about how I was away and whatever. So before we begin, let's do next month's book club. Now, bear in mind I'm choosing from a much smaller range of books at the moment, just because I have quite the random selection on my shelves. So today I picked a classic. I think next month we'll go for something a bit different, and I promise you guys I am actually going to be on time with the book videos from now on. There will be a video at the end of May, and in that video I will talk about this book. This is Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys. It is a retelling of Jane Eyre from the point of view of the ex-wife in the attic. Sorry to ruin Jane Eyre if you've never read it, but it is kind of really old. So yes, and it's about a Creole heiress who meets a young Englishman and kind of moves to England and all of that stuff. I've read Jean Rhys's, what's it called? I've read Jean Rhys's Voyage in the Dark, which is about a young girl who moves to London. And I had mixed feelings about that book. This is her most famous work. So yes, that is next month's book club book. So February's book club book was The Idiot by Elif Batuman, or Elif, I'm not entirely sure. This book smells of sun cream because I read it in St. Lucia, which is always lovely. This book is about a young woman who goes to college in the 90s. She's at Harvard. I think it's only the first year of her college experience. I'm not sure, I think so. I did read it quite a few weeks ago now, so I'm just stretching my mind back. And it's about kind of the romantic relationship she gets herself into, but also about her friendships, about her kind of travels, her trips abroad, and yeah, about the classes that she takes and all of that kind of stuff. I haven't actually written my book reviews, by the way, you guys, so if I'm all over the place with this video, then I am sorry. So the book is definitely a comedy, and honestly, you guys, I have never laughed out loud at a book so much. I think I must have giggled minorly at a small handful of books once or twice throughout the book in my whole life. But in this book, honestly, I was on my sun lounger cackling to myself. My family were like, are you okay? I laughed so much. I was laughing so much my mum had to immediately read it after me, and she also found it really funny. So I don't think it's just me. So obviously it takes its name from the Russian novel The Idiot, which I haven't read, but it is actually on my to read list. It's on my shelves upstairs, and there's heavy reference to Russian because she learns Russian in the book. But the main character is just completely helpless. She's extremely clever and intelligent, but she just bumbles through life in the most ridiculous way, and I just thought it was really funny. So the book's about language, about relationships, about love, about how you form relationships, about how language informs your relationships. It's because it's about a college experience and about Harvard experience particularly. It is a little bit cerebral sometimes, so it is talking about kind of big ideas occasionally, something that I love, but I think it would annoy some people. I wrote in my notes, compared to Moo and to Helen DeWitt's book, which I've already forgotten the name of, which I really hated, The Last Samurai, which I thought was so annoying and so pretentious, but this was so much more readable and still got across some of those ideas. I mean, not all of them, because DeWitt's novel was very highbrow. And then I also said to compare it to Moo, which is also about a university. That was in my last video, but Moo was a much more kind of big overview. This is a first person narrative, but Moo was also supposed to be kind of like a satire and funny, and this is definitely like a satire on the college experience as well. I know that some of you guys didn't like the book just because it's quite a long book and it's kind of a little bit rambling, so not in terms of its like language, but it kind of, there's not so much like a really strong plot line. You can feel a little bit like it's not really going anywhere at certain points in the novel, though it does ultimately have like an overarching story. I personally didn't mind because I found it so funny, and I thought it was kind of part of the point that she wasn't really supposed to know what she was doing or be able to narrate it in like a very structured way. Ultimately, that's all I really have to say about this book. I just really liked it because I thought it was hilarious. Now, I am missing a book. I don't know where it went. I just want to say, by the way, you guys, there were a lot of wins this week. I am, as I said I was going to do in my last video, going to be rounding up this video in a blog post, and there's going to be possibly more in-depth reviews, I don't know, sometimes they're more in-depth, sometimes they're not, of my kind of top books and worst books, and then there's going to be just little summary synopses of the kind of all the other books basically. So if you guys kind of forget what I've said and don't want to watch a whole like million-hour video, just go check out my blog. There's a book section. So yeah, I'm missing a book. There should be a book here. I have no idea where it went. I remember picking it up at some point and then I put it down somewhere and I just have no idea. I've just searched the whole house, can't find it anywhere. But it's called Tentacle and it's by Rita, Indiana. It's set in Santo Domingo in a kind of post-apocalyptic world. It's got sci-fi elements, it's got like Yoruba ritual elements, so like Santeria elements. Yeah, it's like spiritual and sci-fi and time travel-y. It's a time travel novel, which obviously has been done many times in the sci-fi world, but this is a pretty unique take on it. The book really reminds me of other Caribbean literature that I've read. It's very rich and evocative, it's atmospheric. The language can be quite dense, but also quite blunt at the same time. It reminded me of like Marlon James's work, which we're going to be talking about today. Themes of queerness, because one of the main character basically does change gender, and it's about climate change, it's about kind of ecological disaster, it's about the Caribbean, folklore, socialism, capitalism, art. I called it in my notes a sharp little knife of a book. Because it's a really slim novel, not that you can see, but it's a really tiny little novel, so it really packs a punch. It's very, it's full of ideas. You know, if you're looking for something to write an essay on or something, and any of that sounds kind of familiar or relevant to you, it's definitely worth having a look because it is packed with ideas. It's very much in the style and tradition of Caribbean literature, at the same time completely reinventing it and doing something really new and exciting with it. I really liked it. The only reason that I didn't consider it like a top novel, well, first of all, I read a lot of good books in the past few months. I wasn't as affected by it as I have been some of the other books, but it's really great. It's just very small, so it doesn't really let you kind of get into it. It's not about characterization, it's not about character, it's about its ideas, which can make it more difficult to make it a favourite book, do you know what I mean? But I'm sure if you were to go ahead and study it, you'd be like, this is my favourite book. I would definitely recommend it if it sounds like something that you would be interested in, because it's a good example of its kind. Okay, I'm going to try and go in order now of what I read in what order. So we've got by Hernan Diaz. This book is so good. I loved this book. It's not going to be for everyone at all, but I really liked it. I don't know why. Well, we'll try and describe why. So this book is a reimagination of a Western, or like a frontier novel. I am really into Westerns, particularly obviously reimaginings of it and reinterpretations of frontier and Western, the frontier and Western genre, because obviously older interpretations can be extremely racist and just misconstrue the whole thing as like a grand adventure. But in general, I find that kind of period of history and the space of it very interesting. Lots of the contemporary Western stuff I've just really enjoyed, and this was no exception. So it's about a Swedish boy who travels with his brother to America, and basically just as soon as they get there, he loses his brother and ends up traveling the West for many years looking for him. In the meantime, he obviously lots of things happen to him. So what did I like about this book? This book is super atmospheric. Like, it really is affecting. I hope I'm using the right version of that word. I think I am. Very moving at the same time, because obviously this main character grows up throughout the book, so it is like a coming of age story, but in a completely different way. I said in my notes that it spoke to my soul. Wow, I was really feeling it. But on the back I'm just reading this: a bold lyrical hymn to loneliness, companionship and wonder, which I think is a good description of it. It's really about yeah, it's a quiet book. It's about kind of travel, journeys. It's a really interesting take on a journey novel, because, well, I don't want to spoil it, but it's an interesting take on one. The main character, like I said, does spend a lot of time on his own throughout the novel. It's beautifully written. It's quite a simple style, but it still gets some ideas across. I've written here, it's about growing up and being out of place, language, nature and science, and being lonely. I said it's more atmospheric to begin with. It's got one of the most atmospheric beginnings of a novel that I've ever read. I would like read it out to you guys, but we'd be here for ages because I'd just keep going and going. But yeah, I enjoyed, ultimately it's quite episodic, which is kind of what you might expect. Like, he meets this group of people and then goes away and then meets this group of people. Like, imagine The Revenant, but if it was like much better and in book form. And then Diaz, there's a quote from Diaz, I don't know where I found this, maybe I googled it, he said foreignness is a part of Americanness, and it is like it's very much like got a feeling of foreignness throughout. I don't really know how to describe it, if any of that made any sense. What didn't I like about it? Not much. I personally loved it. I think it's close to a perfect book. There's no perfect books, but it's, for me, I really liked it. Some people might find the kind of story again a bit annoying, because once again it feels almost purposeless, which is almost the point, but it's not got like a really strong through line. You kind of just follow the main character. I think it's Hernan. I think that's how you're supposed to say it. Obviously it's Swedish and I am not Swedish. One thing I really loved about it is that it really is about nature and science, and it has a lot of the kind of theory that I love about nature and matter and stuff in there. I said at one point, is there too much in the way of theory and ideas in this section? I'm enjoying it, but would everyone enjoy it? And it's not particularly, and is it historically accurate? I'm not sure. But I liked it, but it's something to think about if you guys don't like that kind of, when like authors insert kind of theory into books. Anyway, I would really recommend this book. I loved it. This is definitely one of my favourites, so big fan of that one. Next up we have The Water Cure by Sophie Mackintosh, which is obviously longlisted for the Man Booker last year. I really liked this. I expected to hate it. I don't know why. I think in my head I'd like associated it with the other Man Booker longlisters that I was less keen on, like Everything Under, for example, and I just thought I was not gonna like it, and it kind of seemed a bit too dreamy for me, because I don't always get on with kind of dreamy novels. But I ended up really liking this book, but I think a lot of those things will be problems for other people. So what's the book about? This is about 3 sisters who are living on an island with their mum and dad, kind of isolated from everyone. Their mum and dad have told them that off the island it's very dangerous for women to live. It's very toxic for women to live, so they're living there kind of isolated, and they're teenagers. Yeah, then their father dies or goes missing, and somehow men find their way to the island. So it's about how the girls deal with that. So what did I like about it? I liked that it looked at all the complexities of being a woman in a man's world. You know, it didn't just say something like The Power by Naomi Alderman. She came up with a really good, what you need to start with when you start like a novel like that, you come up with a really simple idea and then you execute it. But what she did was kind of made it all too black and white, from what I remember. Please don't kill me. Whereas with this book, she came up with a simple idea that women might actually be physically affected by men, like toxicity wise, but then she kind of really explored the complexities of that idea and also of storytelling and also of like fantasy storytelling, because it's unclear at points, I hope I'm not spoiling it, but it's unclear at points whether that's true, that's even true or not. But then you're like, but am I reading a dystopia where it is true or am I not? It was confidently dreamlike, and the characters are imagined well, they're fully thought out. They're not particularly likeable necessarily, particularly partly because they're very alien, and a lot of this novel feels very unsure and alien and weird. It felt nightmarish, I said. It felt claustrophobic because these three sisters, obviously they have like a sisterly relationship on top of all these like kind of weird ideas. It's got quite a kind of Virgin Suicides vibes in terms of that atmosphere that it creates, but translated onto a completely different thing. Yeah, it's about patriarchy, obviously. It's about violence, it's about power, it's about gender. And what I also liked about it is that the women aren't necessarily perfect in the book, because you expect, because sometimes that kind of happens as well. What didn't I like about this book? Personally, again, it didn't particularly bother me, but this is quite a vague book. There's no answers given. If that's the kind of thing that annoys you, then you're really gonna you don't read this book, because there's no answers. It's obviously done purposefully, but it will annoy some people. It did annoy me minorly at points, but then I kind of came to understand that it was the point, so I kind of just went with it. So yeah, I would recommend this, you know, guys. I really liked it, I really did, and I really thought I wasn't gonna like it, so it was a really nice surprise that I did like it. Okay, we have a classic. We've got The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie by Muriel Spark. I don't have much to say about this book, to be honest. I sped through it. It's about a school teacher in a kind of posh-ish school in Edinburgh. She is a kind of free-thinking modern woman. I believe this is published in 1961, probably written about 1950s period. And she has like a set of favourites at the school that she works at, and she kind of passes on wisdom to these favourites, but at the same time kind of reveals a bit too much probably about her personal life. She keeps talking about how she's in her prime, and you start to get the feeling throughout the book that maybe she's quite insecure about this, and that actually she's not in her prime, and what does it mean to be a modern woman. Some minor drama ensues. Now this is not my kind of book, I think, is the main issue. It does a really good job of what it does. Like, it creates a very iconic character in Miss Jean Brodie. Spark writes her really well, because she's like flawed, you kind of love her, you kind of hate her, you find her irritating, and she's very real, like you can picture her, but it's just, yeah, it's just not my kind of thing. Don't particularly enjoy schoolgirl in the 50s vibes. Also, there's some worrying strains of fascism. I think they are understood to be worrying eventually, but halfway through the book I was kind of like, what is going on here? Like, am I reading what I'm reading? Because Miss Jean Brodie admires Mussolini. If you enjoy classics more than me of that kind of period and that kind of topic, then you'll probably enjoy this, because it is a really good example of what it is. It's just not my cup of tea. Right, we've got our first Marlon James novel. I actually didn't even realise I'd read two until quite, like, I was halfway through the second one, because I feel like early Marlon James and later Marlon James are quite different authors. If you guys don't know, I wrote my first dissertation, my Edinburgh dissertation, on Marlon James's A Brief History of Seven Killings, which I ended up loving. It was one of those books like Tentacle that I read first and I was like, wow, this is packed full of ideas, like I could definitely write on this, but I didn't like love reading it, but I ended up loving it, and I will absolutely be reading everything that Marlon James publishes from now on. But this is his second book, I believe. I've got his other one upstairs, his first one, called John Crow's Devil. But I believe this is his second one. This one's from 2009. This is a novel about slavery. It's about a girl called Lilith, as she grows up on a plantation as a slave in Jamaica. And yeah, it's about Lilith as she kind of tries to and strives to improve her position, but that obviously means getting closer to masters, all the kind of complexities and betrayals that happen as a result of that. There's lots to like about this book. Again, in other months it might have made its way into my top book. It is very good. It's very willing to look at the grey areas of plantation life and the kind of master-slave dynamic because of the way Lilith is and the way she tries to get herself into kind of a better position. And it looks at all the different, how that really affects everyone around her. So yeah, it's not just looking at the uber violent stuff, but it's also looking at her kind of her love with a master figure. I feel like it runs the full gamut of slave life. It really goes from, you know, it covers all sorts of themes to do with slavery, like the family unit, the idea of inheritance, and there's a Creole character, like a white Creole character. I said it was high drama and action, sometimes moves too fast. But yeah, sometimes it was a bit confusing and I couldn't quite follow it. There was one section where I was like, what is going on here? I'm not really sure what's happening. So what I didn't like about it was that I felt like the title's a bit misleading. It's not really about this coalition of night women who, you know, are fighting against slavery, and I feel like there could have been more of that. This novel is very violent, so that's something to think about. All of James's novels that I've read so far are very violent, so that's also just his style. Okay, his book I didn't like. This is Like a Fading Shadow by Antonio Muñoz Molina. This is about James Earl Ray, who assassinated Martin Luther King. I have a lot of problems with this book. It semi-redeemed itself towards the end, but nowhere near enough. This book really, really heavily focuses on James Earl Ray, and it really adds like a sheen of glamour to his life, even though not much is actually known about him. So it really, and it also doesn't discuss his kind of abhorrent viewpoints anywhere near enough. But yeah, it makes him almost like Bond-like at some points, and I was just like, what is going on here? At the same time, Molina, it's like a weird book genre, this book. It's at the same time as it's looking at James Earl Ray, it's also looking at Muñoz Molina's own past, and it's his and talking about his relationship with his first wife. And it was just so self-indulgent. I don't know if you guys know what I mean, but there's like a kind of genre of man books which are about drinking, smoking and jazz music, which just pass over my head completely. I don't like them at all. Yeah, so towards the end we got a little bit more Martin Luther King. It seemed to be slightly self-aware at some points on its views towards women, but then would immediately go back to being really self-indulgent and, like, I would say sexist. It is a novel in that kind of weird genre-bending way that's trying to talk about creating a story and history and how you piece together history and how you write history. I mean, maybe you could say that he was trying to show how you could make James Earl Ray a glamorous character just from evidence that he'd actually found. That was like the point. Isn't writing weird? Isn't writing history weird? But I just don't know. It's a no from me, you guys. Don't recommend. It's also boring. So, right, we have 2 more N.K. Jemisin novels. These are the final books of hers that I hadn't read yet. I believe there's a novella that tacks on to the end of the series I read in the last book video. Yeah, novel-wise, I have now read all of her work. So these books are set in a kind of ancient Egypt, and they're fantasy again. Mostly the fantasy revolves around the idea of dreaming and dreams, other realms, and certain people have powers to kind of enter dreams and change dreams. It feels a bit more formal in style than Jemisin's other books that I've read, and less kind of colloquial in terms of how it's written, but I think that's kind of part of the atmosphere of this book, and I would say that they're very atmospheric. They're very, I would say, like luscious, like they feel, you really get a good sense of the world that Jemisin is building in these books. And yeah, I said they had sustained tension, they're page turners, you want to read on, you want to find out what's going to happen. What didn't I like about this book? There wasn't much not to like. I recommend these over the Inheritance trilogy, which is the one I read in the last book video, but not as much as Broken Earth. Obviously Broken Earth is amazing. There's not as many ideas in these 2 books. Even I think the Inheritance trilogy had slightly more ideas, which I like personally in my fantasies and my like speculative fiction in general. I like there to be some ideas, but there were some in here. Religion, faith, peace and violence I identified as the main ideas, because yeah, faith and religion is quite a big one, because that's kind of where a lot of the power comes from in the books. I really like these and I would recommend them. Oh, I'm missing another book, but I also read In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. So this is obviously one of the first kind of true crime books. It's by Truman Capote, was a journalist, I believe, and yeah, it's about the murder of the Clutter family. I don't actually know when they were murdered. I would imagine the 50s, 59. They were farm ranchers, wealthy farm ranchers, and two con men basically just came in and killed them. I have a feeling that this book hasn't aged well, was my feeling when I read it. I feel like it was a bit exploitative. Capote really focuses on the killers and seems almost sympathetic, particularly to one of them, and he focuses less on the victim. You do get some at the beginning of the novel, but it does feel exploitative of their murder for his, I don't know, his voice seems kind of, again, a bit self-indulgent, I would say. But yeah, I think it kind of pales in comparison to modern approaches to true crime and just feels a bit off at times. I do think it's an interesting work in terms of the idea of it being like is it a non-fiction novel, because of how much kind of Capote had to imagine and write about. How much of it is fictionalized and why and to what ends. I think all of that stuff's quite interesting to think about, and the style of it's interesting to think about. I didn't think the writing was particularly amazing, because I was expecting it to kind of be really good. I wrote in my notes that it was a bit more tabloidy than I was expecting, and not the most sensitive treatment. So that's what I thought about In Cold Blood. I've just realised how many books we have to go through, so and I've been talking for 53 minutes already. Next we've got Flights by Olga Tokarczuk. I don't know how to pronounce this. She's a Polish author. She won the Man Booker International Prize, as you can see. Her and her translator. I hated this book. really didn't like it. This is a book, what is it about? It's like lots of little either stories, meditations on ideas. It does seem to have like one narrator who's like it's about journeys and travelling. It does seem to have one narrator who seems to be narrating it, who's kind of a young woman who travels a lot and yeah, is generally itinerant. But I really found it so boring that I had to stop reading it halfway through. It was very uneven. Some of it was just like, I think there was one story that I really liked and thought the tension was really good in it. It's about a guy on an island whose wife goes missing and nobody can kind of figure out what's happened. And there's some occasional good sentences here and there, but generally I found it really irritating, like trying way too hard to be profound and clever. I thought it had sexist tendencies occasionally, like cliched stuff, like I think the narrator says at some point like, I like dark stuff. Like some of the facts were like flat out wrong, like there'd be like scientific sections with like really wrong facts, and it wasn't like part of the narrative to have like wrong facts presented, like they were just wrong, like badly researched. And like just things like sentences like barbarians don't travel, or like, I don't know, I just found it, honestly guys, I really disliked it, and it was boring on top of all those problems, so I was just like not gonna read the rest. I do have her other book upstairs, the one that she's been nominated for this year, so I am going to try that. Apparently it's very different, so we're going to give it a go, but I am a bit nervous. So guys, here is our second Marlon James novel. This is Black Leopard, Red Wolf. This has received a lot of hype. It's been kind of like heavily marketed. It's a fantasy novel set in the first book in a trilogy, I believe it's going to be, and it's set in kind of some sort of ancient Africa. I really liked it. but I think that this is not a book for everyone. I feel like it's been marketed as a kind of something that everyone will really enjoy, but James is a difficult author and I don't think it would be for everyone. You've got to be ready to really invest a lot of time and energy, because James writes in a very, I've said sumptuous here, it can be a bit convoluted. I don't want to say convoluted because that sounds negative, but it's quite complex. Like his sentences, his sentence structure can be quite complex. Anyway, let me talk about what it's about before I get into this. But it's about it's first person narrative. It's told from the point of view of essentially the Red Wolf. He is a guy with a wolf's eye. He's well known for being able to smell really well. He's known for his nose. And therefore he gets the name Tracker, because he's kind of hired by various people to track down, you know, cheating husbands, missing children, and he is hired along with a band of other beings, some of them animals, some of them witches, some of them spirits, some of them gods, to find a missing child, and he kind of uncovers a conspiracy in the process. Yes, and there's obviously more to come because this is not a finished series of books. But in the midst of that, this is kind of like a hallucinogenic novel. Like it's very, particularly the first 100 pages or so. I don't know if it's just like it takes that long to get into it, or whether it's because it's really describing the main character's kind of life up until the point that he's hired to do this thing for that first 100 pages. So it's less kind of driven by a specific plot line and more setting it all up. Like all sorts of crazy beings come across Tracker's path, and there's a lot of violence. I said that it reminds me of Bessie Head, who is an African author. The novel I read of hers for one of my courses in Edinburgh was just absolutely nuts. Like it was just like, you just think like, what's going on here? Like it just crazy. I can't even begin to describe it to you guys, because I just feel like as soon as I begin to describe it, you'll be like, I'm never reading that book. Anyway, I really liked it. There is so much in here, but you do have to fight for it. You have to concentrate really hard. You have to make it through. Like, I love James's language. I think he's a really accomplished author, but it's not easy to read. There's so much in here. Yeah, a surreal hallucinatory experience, I said. Yeah, it's not about the psychological character building kind of stuff, even though I do think James has a real talent for making like movable and lovable characters that are flawed, but you really feel for them and really get into them. I remember that from A Brief History of Seven Killings. Yeah, strong links to African novels, but also existing fantasy, but in a completely new way. I said it's about love, queerness, queer love and family lines, gender, hybridity, journeys, space and the mind, how power and love and violence interact, inheritance, mothers, all sorts of things. There's so much. There is really so much in here. And also it's a good story. Like once you get into it, once he gets on his quest, it's a really good story as well. Sometimes I think it dwells on things for like just a little bit too long, or like it builds things up to be really scary or whatever, and then it doesn't quite feel as scary as it could be. But I don't know if that's because you're by that point desensitized to James's kind of crazy world. But yeah, I would say definitely just push through those first 100 pages and see how you get on if you're going to read this. But it's great. This will be like an iconic fantasy series, I can tell. Next up, we have Washington Black by S.E. Edugyan. This is a book about a young slave who ends up being taken away plantation that he lives on by one of his masters, who has this kind of weird airship contraption that's on the front of the book. So it's kind of like moving towards like steampunk, kind of in an old-fashioned style. Like it's not using old-fashioned words or anything, but it's quite formal feeling. Don't know if that makes sense. I said it's a strange and ultimately haunting book which appears by turns straightforward and then surreal. It's a story again about inheritance and parenthood. It's about a journey across the world. It's looking at the burden of power, who's responsible for what in a world where slavery exists. Yeah, I've said the language is like an old adventure story. That's what I thought in my notes. This is a very different kind of slavery novel because the main character does not spend the whole of the book in slavery and ends up a freeman. So what I really liked about the book was the ending, but obviously I can't really talk to you guys too much about that, but I said it was practically mythic by the end, and it's a really moving ending. But I didn't love the book throughout it, and it does have some problems. Like, I think it moves way too fast at times, and it seems to have some big gaps in the plot. The first part, when the main character's at the plantation, seems very fleshed out. The kind of latter parts do seem like really speedy at times, like I can't even keep up. At the same time, at least things are always happening. I almost think sometimes that it's supposed to be very uneven as well. Another potential problem with this book is that there's not a lot of the steampunk fantasy elements going on for very long. I think it must be about 10 pages on which it kind of happened, so it's not got that kind of element for very long. But I enjoyed it. I thought it was a good book. I would recommend it. I think it was the ending that really changed things for me with this one. It was just really unusual and I really liked it. But yeah, I didn't love the book at all times. I thought it was, sometimes it could just be a little bit on the dull side, and yeah, too fast at times. You didn't really get a feel for what was really happening. Another unusual book with an unusual ending is Roddy Doyle's Smile. This is actually the first Roddy Doyle that I have read. I would like to read more, having read this book, so that's always a good sign. It's about a writer, possible writer, after his divorce, and how he's kind of tackling this new loneliness, and he goes to the pub every night. It has a kind of twist at the end of the book, so it ends up being less straightforward than I've just described it. It's definitely about being a man, about manhood. Also, by the way, trigger warning on this one. Trigger warning on lots of these books. Marlon James is very violent. Please be aware of that before you read any of his books. It's going to be about some really violent stuff that is often distressing. Anyway, with Smile, it is child sexual abuse, so please be warned about that. So yeah, it's about how something like that can really affect your life. So yeah, a strange book. I'm not sure I'd recommend this one because I do think it almost seems half finished at times. I don't know, not one of my favourites anyway. So next up we have Warlight by Ondaatje. This is about a couple of kids whose parents just sort of randomly disappear. They tell them that they're going to leave them. Their father goes to Singapore, and it kind of turns out, I don't think this is a spoiler because you kind of find out pretty early, but it turns out his mother, it's set in the aftermath of World War II, by the way, but it turns out his mother is in the intelligence. When their parents leave, they're kind of left with kind of a strange motley crew of what seems to be criminals looking after them. What I liked about this novel was that I thought it was interesting. It was kind of an unusual take on the World War II kind of period. I thought the kind of character, the first person narrative was very fleshed out. It was very well thought out. It was believable. The character was believable. I did find it a little bit bitty. I didn't really know what the driving force of the story was, but in a different way to the other ones, whereas it seemed to be the kind of point in the other books. I'm not sure it is the point in this one, so it just felt a little bit kind of all over the place, and at times not super exciting either. Again, it's kind of about motherhood and inheritance, the inheritance of the war as well, and kind of how that seeps through into people's daily lives afterwards. It's very much about maps and space and place. But yeah, I thought it had a moving ending though. So there were parts of it that I thought were moving and parts of it that I was like, not massively interesting or interested in this. So yeah, kind of middling one for me. Again, I'm not sure I would really recommend you go out and read it, but if it does sound like your kind of thing, then you might enjoy it. Another odd book, really doing all sorts of genres. This is The Buried Giant by Kazuo Ishiguro. It's about ancient England, and it's kind of like an Arthurian fantasy type thing. It's quite formal in style, it's very old-fashioned in its style on purpose. Yeah, so it's about a couple who go out on a journey to find their son. They're an elderly couple and they go out to, find their son in what they think is a neighbouring village, but there's been a kind of mist settled over the land which is making people forget everything. Not only things that happened many years ago, but things that happened yesterday. So it's looking at memory, about forgetfulness, about what that does to relationships and history and the way people see themselves, the way people see other people. Yeah, and it's also about growing old. Like, it's not often I read books that are about old people. Is that really weird? But yeah, it's not often that you get a book that's kind of from that point of view. So it's also about that, and it's very much about the kind of relationship between the couple, like the main couple. So which can be, you know, quite sweet as well. So I found it quite moving and touching. Something I didn't like about it, or something that I think people might not like about it, is that it has a very frustrating ending. Like super frustrating. I think I would recommend this one. Again, it wasn't like, oh my god, I love this book, but I think I would recommend this one just because it's quite an unusual book. I don't read much like it. I think Ishiguro's take on ancient England is quite interesting. It's not going to be like any other Ishiguro that you've read. Every single Ishiguro book that I've read, I think I've read like 4 now, this might be my 4th, is completely different. Which I kind of love. I think his take on it is really interesting. Next we have some poetry. We've got Kai Miller's There Is an Anger That Moves. It's about being Jamaican in England, and also about being Jamaican. I found this collection to be pretty uneven. Some poems were really great, some were really just not very great. But if you're interested in kind of immigrant poetry, or Caribbean poetry, then this could be a really nice place to start. They're very easy to read, and there are some good ones in here, just some of them I was a bit like, I found the ones about his family members to be particularly good. Also, it's very much about like God and faith. It's about finding yourself as a poet, which is quite an interesting kind of theme and idea. Yeah, and some of them are funny, some of them are serious. It was about dance. There's lots of stuff about dance and music. That is There Is an Anger That Moves. Right, we're on to our final 2 books now, you guys. First up we have The Gloaming by Kirsty Logan, which is about a Scottish island, and it's kind of like semi-magical. Again, a kind of magical realism type of thing. It's kind of there subtly, but it's about a young girl who kind of encounters family tragedy, and it's about her mum and her dad and their relationship, and her mum's relationship with her and her sister, and about her and her relationship with her sister. Initially I thought it was kind of a bit try hard in terms of just the style of it, kind of reminding me, just like, you know, when people just try to be too meaningful without actually adding any meaning. But I did think it was gripping and it kept the action moving, but then it got really kind of dull in the middle, and kind of just got a bit ridiculous as well. And by the end I just thought it was a bit forgettable. Not enough magic, I said, and yeah, frequent stupid sentences. So not a huge fan of this one, sadly. Don't think I would recommend it. Finally, we have a graphic novel. We have Sabrina by Nick. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. Is it Danasso? This is a graphic novel about a woman that goes missing and is murdered, and her killer ends up filming the murder and like publishing it in places. So it's kind of talking about modern media, about going viral, about how that affects people around that are kind of personally involved with a crime like that, or anything really. And so I thought that aspect of it was really good, and I thought that the graphic novel format actually worked really well to show very modern ideas about media in a non-weird way, because in novels and stuff that can sometimes feel very awkward. So I thought the graphic novel format was really, really good for that. And I thought it was really good, very accurate, very concerning, which I think was the point. One thing I didn't like about it, or that people might not like about it, is that this is not really a graphic novel that's about the artwork. Like, it's very basic and it's all in like very muted colours, which is obviously like the point, that's the style of it, but it might just annoy some people. I definitely would recommend reading this because I think it's worth it if you're kind of new to graphic novels and you want to see kind of what they can do, what they can achieve that like other formats can't. I think this is a really good example of that, and also a really good meditation on like modern media and the way that we consume things these days, particularly violence and stuff. So that is it, you guys. I've been talking for almost an hour and a half. My throat is dry, but I really hope that you enjoyed this video. I will be back at the end of May, so in a month's time, talking about Wide Sargasso Sea, amongst other things. Thank you guys so much for watching today, and yeah, I will see you again very soon. Bye!